Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you to the first in our GAIN regulatory webinar series entitled the Regulatory Route to Commercial Nuclear Deployment. As we get started, I wanted to go over a couple of logistics. Those are on the next slide. Again, today you're going to be hearing primarily from Phil Hildebrandt and Roger Matson, both a couple of very experienced folks within the industry who I think can bring a lot of good insight and background to our advanced reactor community as we work towards deployment going forward. I'll say a few words at the end as part of a wrap-up session and to summarize a couple of topics. And a couple of other logistics. I'd ask that you all be sure that your camera is turned off and that your audio is muted as reflected there in the second bullet. I'll also mention, at least for those of us working at the Idaho National Lab, that we get much better performance through these GoToWebinar series events if our VPN is disconnected. So I'd suggest you do that if you're at INL and you consider that option if that's available to you if you work in another organization. As we go through the webinar, you'll notice that there's a question box available to you on the right-hand side of the screen. You can use that for two different things. One obviously is we'd ask that you put your questions for the speakers in that spot, and we'll collect those and evaluate them, and then we'll cover a series of questions at the end of the webinar. You can also use that screen or that field to address or ask questions around any technical difficulties you might be having with either the audio or the video or any other parts of the connection. And one last thing I'll mention, that we plan to record the webinar so that any portions of it would be available to either attendees or folks that you would like to share it with following the session, along with the presentations that we'll be going through today. Next slide. So just very briefly, we've got an agenda that's aligned with or slated for about 3 hours. Two major portions. Phil will start off with about 45 minutes on historical development of nuclear energy, with covering the period of nominally the 40s to the 60s. Roger will then follow with an additional nominally 45 minutes on carrying forward from the late 50s into the 80s and current day, with some of the major evolutions within the regulatory framework during that time. As I mentioned, I'll have some wrap-up topics that I'll cover near the end in the third slot. And then we're working to leave about 40 minutes or so for questions at the end of the session. And our intention during those 40 minutes is to get through as many of the questions as we can. And any that are left unaddressed or uncovered, we'll follow up following the session. And with that, I'll turn it over to Phil to get started on the first. Oh, I forgot about this slide. We do consider this to be or have currently structured this to be a 3-webinar series. Again, this first one is providing some background from the 50s through the 80s to better understand how the existing regulatory framework came to be what it is. In webinar 2, we'll spend some time focusing on the hierarchy of documents that are inside of the NRC's document system these days, and how you can maneuver and navigate through that process on the path to deployment. The third webinar is currently envisioned to be a discussion of how to manage regulatory risk as you pick a licensing path or licensing strategy. And as I'll describe at the end of the session today, we're always interested in any feedback or adjustments you all may have or suggest for either of those two, or even if we need additional sessions beyond those two. So keep that in mind as we're going through today's discussion. And now with that, I'll turn it over to Phil.
Very good, Jim. Good afternoon to everyone. As Jim said, this is a historical development of nuclear reactor technology, and I emphasize it's a brief summary. Jim only allotted 45 minutes, and we can talk for hours, Roger and I, on this subject. So I'll just note we're going to touch on a number of things and go by others that aren't as important on the understanding of the purpose of this webinar series. Next slide, Holly, if you would. The bio's there for people that don't know me. The summary thumbnail of that is I spent 10 years working for Rickover, the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program. The next 30 years in various aspects of the commercial nuclear world at many operating plants. And over the last 12 to 15 years, primarily in the advanced reactor world, looking at both development and also how do we get to a sustainable future for nuclear energy as a country. Next slide, please. The topics we're going to touch on, and again, these are going to be very briefly touched on given the list you can see in front of you, is provide some context and perspectives on the early development in particular, focused around three areas: the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program, the U.S. Power Reactor Development Programs, which were partnerships between government and the private sector primarily, the Shipping Port Power Reactor Project, and then I'm going to convolve those three bullets into commercialization with a focus on how did we get to commercialization and what drove it, because it wasn't simply a technology discussion. And at the end, I'll then put on the table some important uncertainties that existed in the regulatory environment as a result of where we were in the early 60s, and it'll set up the discussion, which Roger will then carry on and for the three eras of regulatory development he'll discuss. Next slide, please. First of all, from the standpoint of each of these discussions that I'll go through, we're going to both deal with both context and perspective. And what do I mean by that? Context of what was going on domestically and internationally in the world. What were the things that were making the decisions that we lived with at the time? And then secondly, the perspective. The early perspective in this is primarily from that of the government, the US government, and other governments, but the US government will be our focus. And then transitioning to the private sector. What was the perspective of the private sector as regards development of nuclear energy? Next slide, please. Some terminology. There's nothing magic about this slide, but just so that as I may use these terms, or Roger or Jim later on, we are talking about the same thing. These are the types of reactor applications that we'll be using in these presentations. There's some others besides. But first of all, research and test reactor, I think a very basic thought process. Looking for the science of reactors and the beginning of the engineering for reactors. Production reactors, which are focused obviously on materials for the weapons complex. And so their designs weren't focused on how do you produce power, they're focused on how do we produce materials that would be produced within those reactors. The next is propulsion reactors. Now that's the area where a lot of what we'll discuss today towards the commercialization of light water reactors, that's where it came from. And this is the military drive, mission-driven thought process on deploying weapons delivery platforms. And in particular, naval ships such as submarines and aircraft, I'll dismiss right here, which we had canceled any further development on aircraft propulsion by 1961. But I'll spend some time talking about the naval ship propulsion because it sets the stage for commercialization of nuclear energy for power generation. And then lastly, power reactors themselves, generating electric power, and various programs starting in the mid-1950s. I'll note that some early activities, particularly in Europe, explored the combined purposes of singular reactor concepts. That is, combining power and production, for instance. We, as in the US, looked at that some as well, but it was determined that you have limited success going down that path because there's some competing and contradictory objectives and requirements that go along with that. Next slide, please. Some context. Where are we starting this? Now, this is the World War II weapons program, Manhattan Project, which you all recognize the term, and then emerging into the Cold War environment. Cold War, that situation, that condition where we were for 40 years, from the late 40s to the early 90s, over 40 years, in a condition of wartime status in reality, but called the Cold War because there was limited direct engagement between various countries. The Cold War and its priorities and what was important in the Cold War drove a lot of the conversation that I'm going to be summarizing for you here today. There's two milestone events that occurred as we go into the Cold War environment. One was the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, which was the act that put the civilians in control of everything nuclear, but it was still a government endeavor, partly government endeavor, but took control out of the military hands in 1946. 1954, the next Atomic Energy Act now provided the opportunity for the Atomic Energy Commission to regulate nuclear energy, to have private sector access, and to license the use of fissile materials, and a very important transition point in the eventual commercialization of nuclear energy. Now, power reactors, the concept of power reactors, were often overshadowed by the development of nuclear weapons and the weapons delivery platforms. The military focus still, even though it's now civilian regulated, we were still focused on things having to do with weapons and things having to do with weapons delivery, like submarines, which we'll talk about some more. And we had a set of unaligned agendas. The president, at the time, President Eisenhower, in the early 50s, was focused heavily on how do we commercialize, how do we privatize the nuclear energy world. The National Security Council, which was focused heavily on, as you might expect, national security and the military side of this discussion. The Congress, which was overseeing all this, and in particular through the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, which we'll talk a little bit about later. The Atomic Energy Commission, which is the technology focus and what should their priorities be, and the private sector. The private sector was trying to decide, is this something that I want to invest in? Is this something I want to eventually take to commercialization? Who's going to pay for it, et cetera? We'll get to that in a while. And that last bullet then, a vision, Atoms for Peace, which was under President Eisenhower initiative. Who's going to lead development? Who's going to pay for commercialization? That sounds a bit familiar. It's what we're going through today with activities like the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program and other initiatives where the government pays part of the cost of development. We're debating that today. Who should pay for it? How much? When? That was a very similar debate that we had back in the 50s and found our way through. The highlighted item at the bottom of the slide is stating what, the obvious. You need to understand the historical development to understand how nuclear energy evolved, get a grasp of the forces at play, and I'll emphasize that it was heavily policies and politics and personalities, not technology, that drove the direction of what we're going to be talking about here. Next slide, please. A primary focus now during the Cold War was the so-called nuclear arms race. This is the race between the West and the Soviet bloc in the USSR. And most countries that were involved in this had something that's analogous to what I show here, which is a snapshot in 1960 of the nuclear triad. The missiles on the left, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the long-range bombers such as the B-52, G, Stratofortress, and on the bottom right, the submarine-based missiles. All of this was part of the nuclear arms race. A very similar triad could be on this slide today. All you do is you replace the Titans with Minutemen III. You replace the Stratofortress with the latest version of it, plus some other types of bombers. You replace the George Washington class fleet ballistic missile submarines with the latest Trident-based. But we still have this nuclear triad existing today as a focal point of national security strategy. Next slide, please. I'm going to focus on the bottom right-hand corner of that triad, and it's the nuclear Navy, because that's most pertinent to our discussion here on commercialization of nuclear energy. Shown there is obvious as labeled. The Nautilus on the left, the first of the nuclear-powered submarines, and on the right, a more contemporary fleet ballistic missile submarine. Next slide, please. Now, what happened in the beginning? Now, this is the late 1940s. The war is over. Manhattan Project is being disbanded. The production reactors are being refocused. The Navy was uncertain what it wanted its post-war and future fleet to be. Large debate in the naval establishment within the government. The Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, had exclusive authority over nuclear energy research and development, but didn't know what its priorities were. And its priorities came from a lot of different directions. I gave you that unaligned agendas thing on an earlier slide. It's trying to figure out where in all that it should put its priorities. There was an emerging perspective within the naval establishment that nuclear energy could be transformative to the future of submarine warfare, a true submersible. It's interesting. People have questioned me on this item before. We had submarines. It's back as early as in World War I. We had submarines which played an important part in World War II, but what they truly were surface ships that periodically submerged. And they weren't true submersibles that were difficult to detect, unlimited cruising range, and unlimited duration on station. They weren't true submersibles. And so now we had an opportunity. We saw where nuclear energy could be transformative in that. It was important this is where personalities start coming into it. The early support of Admiral Chester Nimitz, who at that time was the Chief of Naval Operations, starting in 1946, gave an impetus to the concept of the nuclear propelled submarine. And he and a number of others, but I'll only mention one other name on this page, and that's Rickover, at that time a captain, in combination with some AEC commissioners, not all were in agreement, some senior naval officers, not all in agreement, the National Security Council, not all in agreement, all right? The Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, which is probably had the most internal agreement of any organization, and we bludgeoned the way through the bureaucratic maze of the US government to finally get to an agreement to proceed with reactor development for submarines. And so it was no small task to start this ball rolling. Next slide, please. And then the big, in the aspect of the nuclear Navy, the next question, okay, who's in charge? Now, the Atomic Energy Commission owns nuclear energy, and they weren't going to give that responsibility away. Navy owns the ships. Congress owns the money. And the national laboratories were fighting for controlling technology position, but it was heavily oriented towards science rather than the application, such as a submarine. And hence, we had this fight going on amongst all these various organizations and people and personalities. And as it states on the slide, this painfully evolved into Rickover taking increasing authority in both the Atomic Energy Commission and the Navy, with its power base being the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy in the Congress. That's a very important sentence. There's a lot in that sentence. Okay, this is a double-hatted organization, the Atomic Energy Commission and the Navy, two different agencies. The Congress, Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, the power base. Neither of the agencies actually doing the development were really the base of power for Rickover. And organizationally, the entity called Naval Reactors, it never had that literal name, but the organization called Naval Reactors had authority both in the Atomic Energy Commission and in the Navy. So at the right there, just to give you some flavor, because these are personalities you won't necessarily have run into before. They're the less nationally known personalities. We can see Rickover at the beginning of this table. If you go around from left to right to the table, on the far left is Bob Panoff. Next is Howie Marks. Next is Milt Shaw. The next is Harry Mandel. And the next is Jack Grigg. And on the far right is Dave Layton. Why are they important? Well, besides being several of the senior staff, these folks were formative, were part of forming what it is became the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program and how we evolved from there to the commercial world. These are the gentlemen that I worked with and for over years. I'll mention a couple others, given their names here. Harry Mandel and Bob Panoff, Mandel in the center, Panoff on the left, were the founders of NPR Associates, which is a very well-known consulting engineering services company in the commercial world today, which they formed in 1946, or excuse me, 1964, I misspoke. And then Milt Shaw, third from the left, who was starting in 1964 through 1973, was a director of the in the Atomic Energy Commission of Reactor Development. These gentlemen, in particular, are very formative, and not many of them is well known in terms of their influence. And everybody uses Rickover's name. Rickover was the leader, but what he knew was to surround himself with good people. He had an organization when I worked with him for 10 years of about 200 people. And these were amongst the leaders of that organization. So let me go on. We have Naval Reactors, a very important organization in the center of nuclear energy reactor development. Argonne and Oak Ridge National Labs took on the original technology development roles, very essential roles. And I'll talk about it a little bit more as we go on. Very essential roles in the early technology identification, development, understanding what possible paths we ought to go down. And as it evolved toward more thoroughly the engineering aspect of it and actually designing the applications, evolved into the Bettis and Knowles Atomic Power Laboratories. Bettis run by Westinghouse and the Knowles Atomic Power Laboratory run by GE at that time, who worked hand in hand with Electric Boat Shipyard to design and build the first nuclear submarines. With different operating contractors today, that basic organization continues today. Next slide, please. Now, we have some decisions to make. What nuclear energy technology? How do we make the decisions? What was the requirement? And I'm going to say this more than once. This is mission driven now. This is not economically driven. This is not business driven. This is how do we fulfill the mission of weapons delivery platform that fulfills the military's needs. Now focus here on the robust propulsion plant design, which is about halfway down the page. And I'm doing this in contrast, and look at it that way, to what became the commercial reactors. For the propulsion plant application in the Navy and in submarines in particular, they had to be highly maneuverable. What do I mean by that? I had to be able to change powers at rates that were 2 orders of magnitude faster than a commercial unit can today. Had to be unaffected by extreme ship motions, either intentional motions because you're maneuvering the submarine in a battle condition, or because the sea, which does what it wishes, makes the ship move, whether it's rotational or translational. The reactor had to be battery hardened. Shock loadings that are well beyond today's seismic loadings that we're used to in the commercial world. Battle short. I'm going to just stop on that one for a second for concept. Battle short is something used in the military environment where you basically bypass your safety protection provisions. In the naval nuclear program and in the submarine world, this was you go to battle short and you remove any protection on the reactor. You do it intentionally in the battle situation, so you don't have the reactor tripping off, scramming on you in the midst of a battle situation. Hence, the robustness of the reactor design was essential so that you were able to demand a tremendous amount out of that reactor without it damaging the reactor and recognizing you weren't having protective circuitry in place at the time. Quiet operations, simple to operate. We called it sailor proof, which is derogatory, but it was simple to operate. Didn't require a PhD to understand the operations of this particular reactor. Largely maintainable by forces afloat, that is the sailors, in remote locations. Passive nuclear safety, that's today's terminology, and an endurance of many years before refueling. And the little box on the right gives you the feeling. The military shipboard application nuclear energy for propulsion is demanding and requires considerably more robust design than for the land-based power plant. Next slide, please. So we looked at several, and I'll just summarize here without going through the trials and tribulations of picking technologies, but we looked at 3 that are listed there: pressurized water, helium-cooled, and sodium-cooled. And then based on initial studies and development, which were helped through by Argonne and Oak Ridge, we decided on 4 in reality, but 2 different technology full-scale demonstrations. One was the submarine thermal reactor, most like today's PWRs, which is one at the prototype out in Idaho, and the second in a ship. And they were built in parallel. They're built in parallel, not because that's the best approach to developing technology, but we're in a Cold War. And we have to perform very rapidly to support the military needs. Secondly was the submarine intermediate reactor, sodium-cooled reactor. Again, a prototype in a ship, the Seawolf in that case. Next slide. Now, these full-scale demonstrations were extremely important. And out of them came an understanding, not entirely surprising, but an understanding of which of these 2 fundamental technologies were best aligned with what the military needs were in the Navy's program. It turns out that the S1W prototype in Idaho and the Nautilus, which were the PWR design, were operationally successful. And there were many technical hurdles that remained, but they could be accommodated and resolved in a manner that was timely for the mission. Unfortunately, the sodium-cooled reactor, the S1G prototype, and the Seawolf had a number of material, equipment, and operational issues. I won't read those points to you, but those issues were such a hill to climb that we concluded the pressurized water reactor technology was going to be more successful. If we'd had unable to been successful with PWR technology, by the way, just as an opinion, we would have made the sodium reactor technology work. We weren't after the absolute best technology, but we were after one that was going to work in the shortest period of time and fulfill the mission needs. That's the drive here. And the economics weren't on the table at this point in time. Next slide, please. So this slide just says PWR technology became the choice. It's based on the best available information of a fledgling industry. And it was driven by the demands of response to Cold War priorities for mission and for timing. It's turned out to be the right choice, even over the long term, but we didn't know that at the time, okay? And it was brought into being successfully to a large extent because of a very conservative design philosophy, which has allowed operational challenges to be accommodated and resolved without a detrimental effect on the mission at any time. That last bullet is extremely important and it underpins the entire effort with naval reactors. Next slide, please. This slide, which I won't go through in any detail, but what it tells you is here's what we went through over the next decade to build a fleet for the nuclear navy of submarines with multiple applications, from attack submarines to ballistic missile submarines. You can read the slide. And we ended up focusing on those 2 areas over time, attack and ballistic missile submarines. And as well as then later on putting propulsion plants in aircraft carriers and guided missile cruisers. The program that was developed for the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program, shipbuilding program associated with that, developed much of the US industrial capability that initially supported the emergence of commercial nuclear power. Very important to understand. So here, this is a program, the infrastructure, the technology, the thought processes that allowed us to then emerge into commercial nuclear power. Next item, please. Next slide. A different perspective. Now the private sector's perspective. This is what I just went through is what's going on over here in the military and in the Navy, and in that part of the Atomic Energy Commission that's supporting. Private sector is looking at this and saying, well, first, they were uncertain which of the nuclear technologies were economic and reliable or economically competitive. Uncertain. they saw limited access to technical information, which was very closely held by the US government. The question was, if we commercialize, will it be global or domestic? The restrictions within the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. And the question was, could it become a global business, or was it going to be limited to a domestic business? And will nuclear power development be led by the public or the private sector? And how much should the private sector invest, or should they? And the last item there is, which is circled, which focuses closer to what we're talking about in this webinar, is there was no comprehensive regulatory framework. There was no plant licensing. There were no export controls. What there was high-level legislation in the Atomic Energy Act, and nothing really written down yet in any comprehensive manner that said this is the regulatory framework within which the private sector might operate. So you can see uncertainty and risk associated with all these pieces of the pie at the time. Next slide, please. Now, I'll just mention a few. I'm not going to go through these in any detail, but there's lots going on in the initial reactor development and demonstration. A bunch of early reactors, production reactors, experiments, they're all listed, many of them are listed, if not all of them there. There was this atomic energy 5-year plan from 54 to 1959. You can see them listed. The last one is circled because it will become important to the commercialization of light water reactor technology worldwide. That's the shipping port power reactor demonstration. Next slide, please. Similarly, there are a number of partnerships developed between the government, Atomic Energy Commission in particular, and the private sector. There were 3 rounds of that. You can see the years, you can see the reactors involved. You may recognize many of them. Some of them didn't become so obviously successful, but these were each of the tries that the private sector engaged in with government, and government helped pay for, in terms of what direction should we go on in power reactor development. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to focus on shipping port because it becomes important in this discussion. And what's on the slide, just 2 photos, one of the shipping port plant there on the left, and the reactor vessel that goes in it. Next slide, please. Talking about the power reactor project and what became known as shipping port. There's some interesting points on this slide, which I'll point you to. One, the S1W prototype, which is now, I'll remind you, that's a prototype for the Nautilus, which is the first pressurized water reactor built in the naval program, achieved full power operations in May 1953. Within a few months, the government had made a decision to build a PWR-based commercial power reactor. Effectively, no operating experience, less than a year's operating experience, a number of technical problems that we had to resolve, which reduced the operating time and the experience gain. But yet, the push here is to go toward a demonstration reactor for commercialization of nuclear energy, nuclear power in particular. And so a decision is made in the government, okay? Now, it's sited at shipping port in Western Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. It was designed and built as a partnership between the Atomic Energy Commission and Duquesne Light. It's on the same site as Beaver Valley is today, okay? And the reactor designed by Westinghouse at Bettis and Stone and Webster, and steam plant by Burns and Rowe. The Atomic Energy Commission picked up most of the bill. Duquesne Light Company picked up the balance of plant. And that was the first partnership of that particular nature, which became a potential predecessor for the way business would be done between the government and the private sector in this area. Now, the shipping port reactor was extrapolated from an aircraft carrier propulsion plant design, which had been canceled in the government world back in the 1953 timeframe. And it's with the naval features removed and all else declassified to facilitate technology transfer to the private sector. There are thousands of reports that came out of this. Now, the decision to have naval reactors in Rickover lead the development by these companies was a highly controversial decision. Rickover wasn't very well liked in Washington. It didn't matter whether it was the Navy or other agencies, he wasn't well liked. And he was a highly driven individual, focused on his particular requirements to fulfill that role. And that, I'm all the way back now to that nuclear triad in that bottom right-hand corner. How do I deliver submarines for purposes of the nuclear triad? That was his focus. Shipping port at the beginning was a distraction to him. It was a distraction. But he decided he could make it into something that would give us a foundation for later surface ship technology, which we did. We used it for the aspects of it for the Enterprise and for the other surface ships that were developed in the early 60s. In December of '57, Shippingport achieved full power operations, the first large-scale nuclear power plant. The demonstration provided a foundation for commercial plants. And this next sentence at the bottom of the page is very important. Although not yet economically competitive, and it was not, its operating experience was exceptionally useful regarding materials and equipment performance. As many important problems were uncovered, some resolved, some not understood for years later, but they were provided a foundation for commercial work. Next slide, please. Underpinning the naval plants, underpinning Shippingport, was an approach to engineering which you might want to think more about these. I'm not sure they do full justice to the approach, but it's very important to the success of naval reactors and the projects that it handled. One, there was a particular focus on engineering and only enough science to complete the design. This is not to take away from the way the national labs tend to do business, but national labs truly want to understand the science. We didn't have time to understand the science, the Cold War. We needed to devise the application, just like the weapons development, the bomb development during the Manhattan Project. Their focus was engineering, not science. And they drew from the science only to the extent necessary and developed that science to make the engineering successful. Extremely conservative technical requirements. Primary objective was to fulfill the mission on the first try. Even though the technologies were yet unproven, the books weren't written, okay? We were designing with side rules, okay? This time frame is a new technology for which the rules weren't yet in place, and we had to be successful on the first try. This is military mission need for the Cold War. We took a very measured stepwise approach, and this occurred not just in the early days, but throughout the life of the naval nuclear program. We took very measured and stepwise steps in moving forward as we innovated nuclear propulsion technology. We applied the Socratic method. Now, this is a cooperative, argumentative approach to engineering, which I don't see practiced very many places. But it was integral to the success of naval reactors, where we really argued our way through the designs. Nothing was assumed or sacred, and it was a very argumentative environment that we worked in, and it was necessary for success to move along at a high speed. Technically competent personnel were the focus of it. Personal responsibility underpinned it. Next slide, please. Now, snapshot. So now it's the early 1960s. Where are we? We've got 3 surface ships built. That's the Enterprise in the Bainbridge and the Long Beach. We've got a beginning fleet of nuclear submarines. That's a fleet ballistic missile submarine. And we have Shippingport. That's what existed within the nuclear Navy and Shippingport that was being overseen by naval reactors and was all based on light water reactor technology. Next slide, please. In the commercial world did some very interesting things around this point in time. These were the first 2 commercial units that had no US government financial support. That's very important. Dresden Unit 1 and Commonwealth Edison, Indian Point Unit 1 is part of Consolidated Edison. One a BWR, one a PWR. One led by GE, the other one led by Westinghouse. It's important to note down there in the blue box at the bottom that the financial commitments and construction permit applications for the above plants were made before any operating experience with Shippingport. No operating experience, because the decisions to build these reactors, you can see the dates up there, construction permits in May 1956. There was no operating experience in Shippingport. It hadn't started operating yet. So these are exceptional business risk positions for these companies to take, both the vendors as well as the owner operators, to engage in what they saw as the future of nuclear energy. I know that advanced reactors today have the opportunity to moderate their business risk by drawing on more than 17,000 reactor years of operating experience from the current global fleet. The fact that it's light water reactor technology, the fact that your advanced reactor may not be water reactor technology, that's less important than the lessons that were learned. And I encourage any and all folks here that are in the webinar that are working on advanced reactor technologies and the development of them, go understand the lessons that were learned out of all that reactor operating experience in the global fleet. Extremely important. It's the subject of multiple days of discussion, which we won't do right now, obviously. Next slide, please. Now, this is all going on in the United States. Meanwhile, what's going on in the rest of the world? They're not sitting on their hands. There are other contenders in Europe, for example, Calder Hall, which operated before Shippingport started up. These were gas graphite technologies, primarily in the UK and France. Interesting concepts, some success initially, more success, and became the centerpiece of the UK reactor business for many, many decades. Next slide, please. Similarly, in the Soviet Union, they weren't too far behind the curve, and they were focused on what became the RBMK reactor design in Russia, and the Soviet Navy, with very parallel to what we were trying to develop. They were just fortunately behind us. Included both pressurized water and lead bismuth cooled technologies, as well as the beginnings of a PWR technology for commercial operation. Next slide, please. Here's Canada. Now, what's the common theme through each of these now? And I'm going to go to that common theme before I talk about Canada. It's the use of natural uranium. The natural uranium was the only thing available at this time to many of these countries. So they had to develop reactor technologies around unenriched uranium. Canada the same way, with heavy water cooled moderated reactors, the CANDU reactors. Experimental reactors, well positioned before the United States. Power demonstration reactors that are listed there in the first of their commercial offerings. Now, I mentioned these contenders in the UK and France, and in the Soviet Union and in Canada. These could have become the centerpiece of commercialization globally. They did not, for the reasons we're about to talk about. Next slide, please. Now, let's bring ourselves back to context so I can go through the commercialization thought process. The context now was it atoms for peace or atoms for war? Where were we headed as the United States? We initially started out as atoms for war. Eisenhower tried to drag it over towards atoms for peace. The national security apparatus in the United States was trying to continue down the military path. There's only so much money. What occurred? Well, there was some technological progress in the Soviet Union, and it's listed there. Thermonuclear bomb, nuclear submarines, intercontinental ballistic missiles, Sputnik, the first satellite, manned space flight. These technological advances and demonstrations by the Soviet Union drove the Cold War discussion in the United States. So we changed our priorities and we upped the ante on the Cold War motivations. We accelerated what we were doing, whether it's building submarines or surface ships with nuclear energy in them, or whether it was the other aspects of nuclear weapon superiority. The red at the bottom under their Cold War motivation is an important element of national security is derived from global nuclear energy leadership and superiority. Let me repeat that. That's central even today. National security, an important element of it, is derived from global nuclear energy leadership and superiority. So as we have watched today, Russia and China starting to take a different role, and they understand what's in red there. Clearly, Russia and China understand what's in red on this slide. They're starting to use the same approach in their endeavors globally with the next generation of nuclear energy. This is extremely important. It was part of the Cold War motivation for the United States. It continues to be the centerpiece of today's strategic national defense. Next slide, please. So what did we do in the 50s to change the paradigm? We had those contenders out there. We had Shippingport, which is behind many of those contenders across the world. Here's some enablers. Atoms for Peace, which I mentioned before, President Eisenhower's initiative. The thing called Operation Candor, which was, acknowledging the nuclear threat while envisioning the peaceful atom. Sales brochure, think of it that way. A sales brochure for the public in the United States that said, we're going to apply the atom, which is now associated with nuclear weapons. And that was, in the public's mind, the centerpiece of what we did with nuclear energy in the 50s. And Atoms for Peace was intended to try to turn the corner toward commercialization and private sector application. As important, in my estimation, more important was the formation of Euratom, which is the atomic group formed in Europe in 1957, and then the signing of the 1958 Accord with the United States. The provisions of that accord are listed there in the bullets. The U.S. to provide financial and technical aid, half the Euratom budget for research and construction. And that lowered the cost of developing and using light water reactor technology compared to gas graphite. So the U.S., through its Cold War national security policy and strategy, was now in the midst of changing the commercialization and what technologies were going to be chosen. The U.S. stepped right in the middle of it as a country here. The U.S. was going to provide enriched uranium. But we hadn't done this before, nor have we shared the technology to get to enriched uranium. We provided 30,000 kilograms of fissile U-235 to this endeavor under Euratom Accord. We proposed 1,000 megawatts electric, which doesn't sound like much in today's world, which was a lot at the time. That resulted in 3 light water reactors being built under this agreement in Europe. And it gave momentum to shaping the European views about the viability of LWR technology and cemented its future. You'll remember the only country that parted from this that was part of the Euratom was UK. Otherwise, they went straight towards LWR technology. There's a lot of other forces at play here, but this is central to why it occurred. Next slide, please. Jim, how am I doing on time?
You're good. You've got about 6 or 7 minutes to go, so you're good.
Good. That works fine. So the result was then LWR technology became the global choice. And it was driven by the maturation of the technology through the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program, the early commercial LWRs, such as Dresden and Indian Point, large number that are being ordered in the U.S. marketplace in the 60s, and the provisions of the Euratom U.S. Accord. And the curve, just as an interesting visual demonstration of how Lightwater reactor technology took off in the mid-60s as the reactor of choice globally. Next slide, please. Now let me move over to regulatory uncertainties. And this is a snapshot now in the early 1960s. As a result of the things that we just talked through, the Atomic Energy Commission regulatory activities focused primarily on LWR technology. That was what they were, the owner operators were interested in. That's where the vendors which were maturing. So that's where the regulatory focus was. Now, driven by economics, the commercial reactor designs lacked design and operational experience that they could derive out of naval and shipping port reactors in some very important areas. Order of magnitude greater power ratings, structurally less robust fuel design, considerably higher temperatures using the same basic materials of construction, and a different reactivity control using chemical shim. Now, so the AEC here is presented with commercial designs which depart in very important ways from the design and operating experience available for the naval program and shipping port. Now, some people will suggest that, well, none of that information was available to the commercial world, and the answer is wrong. There were initiatives taken on intentionally to, even though a lot of the information was classified, that the commercial world could become knowledgeable of what was being done within the naval program. And of course, shipping port was treated as a commercial. The information was fully available. But the commercial world had full knowledge of what was going on in the naval program in the areas that were important, in particular Westinghouse and General Electric. There are some unresolved fundamental reactor safety issues, things like siting requirements, containment and confinement concepts, the need for emergency core cooling systems, which Roger will tell you about. He was top dead center in the middle of that. Source term and atmospheric dispersion modeling. Okay. Fundamental reactor safety issues, which today we are, we can talk about each one of these at extreme length because of the maturation that's gone on. At the time, we didn't have the answers. We had some of the questions. We clearly didn't have the answers. We had a problem within the commercial industry, my estimation, of flexible regulation versus prescriptive regulation. And it was inappropriate industry expectation, in my judgment, that a licensed reactor is a safe reactor solely as a result of fulfilling regulatory requirements and review by AEC. That's wrong. A licensed reactor means you've complied with the requirements of the regulator. It does not make the reactor safe. And the fact that we have those requirements and there's been a review by AEC does not make the reactor safe. So we had an inappropriate industry expectation early on that if they just went to the AEC and the AEC said it's okay, it means it's safe and we should go from there. And central to this, which Roger will talk about further, is the underlying conflict between promotion and regulation of nuclear energy, which was the charter of the Atomic Energy Commission. I mean, the Atomic Energy Commission is doing what they were chartered to do. But there's a real conflict between promotion and regulation. And in some instances, and Roger and I won't take and provide you a bunch of examples today, but in some instances, the Atomic Energy Commission allowed that there were deficiencies in what the private sector was submitting in its applications and compensated it on it through the review and regulatory process. It was the wrong effort by Atomic Energy Commission. They should not have done so. They should have let the industry mature. But they were under, again, under the pressures from the Congress in particular to move nuclear energy along. So they compensated in many places for less than and fully appropriate work by the private sector. Next slide. As a summary, some key messages. Now, we've touched on each one of these from some point or another. Commercialization of power reactors were strongly influenced by the Cold War priorities. That was the drive. Cold War priorities were mission driven, recognize that. Commercial world will be economically driven, business driven. However, commercialization was driven by Cold War priorities and national strategies. nuclear energy leadership and superiority being the central core of national security. Atoms for Peace and Euratom-US Accord set the stage for LWR technology to dominate the global marketplace. It was a result of national policy, relative technological maturity. PWRs became more, and light-water reactor technology in particular became more mature more quickly. Financial and technical assistance, not a search for the most economical, more reliable, or safest concept. That the drive was not the latter, it was the former, and it's important to understand that PWR technology, LWR technology turns out to have been the right choice within the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program. From my perspective, it's been a very good choice for the commercial world, but it's not the only choice. Third bullet down there, the turnkey pricing offered by Westinghouse and GE on some commercial LWRs in 1963 through 66. I get different numbers on this, but somewhere between 12 and 15 reactors. Allowed those two companies to become global industry leaders. Unfortunately, the turnkey pricing resulted in consequent underestimation of the actual cost and has distorted the economics and what was really going to cost to implement and deploy nuclear energy. Exceptional business risk was taken by some private sector companies. I applaud that. And as I said before, the advanced reactor world today can take advantage of 17,000 reactor years of operating experience. The red item at the bottom, the AEC reactor regulation was in its infancy. Began focusing on LWRs, had a bunch of things to resolve, which they subsequently did, on safety areas, and the operational experience dramatically changed the regulator's role and approach, which is where Roger will pick it up and go from here. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Phil. Boy, Holly's doing a good job. We're already on that first slide. You can take it away and go to the second one. I'm Roger Matson. I had my first brush with the regulatory staff of the Atomic Energy Commission in 1965, 56 years ago. They recruited me in 1966 and I joined them in 1967. And I have interfaced with the regulatory staff in various capacities over the last 50-some years. Today, I'm going to hit what I think are the high points of regulatory history. If somebody else gave the talk, they'd probably pick slightly different ones. And we're going to move really fast. If I go too fast or I leave something out that's of interest to you, ask me a question. In 1984, I gave lectures like this in China as they were beginning their nuclear regulatory program. And I learned an interesting phrase from the Chinese about going through a briefing very fast. It's like watching flowers from horseback. So if we turn to the next slide, we'll start to look at the flowers. This talk is divided into 4 sections. The licensing history, and I won't say much more about it than you've already read, and I'll move on to the next slide. So the first period is 1954 to 1975. Up to slide 5, please. So the regulatory program didn't begin before the Atomic Energy Act was amended in 1954 to allow commercial power and to charge the Atomic Energy Commission with establishing a regulatory program to establish standards to provide adequate protection for public health and safety. But even before that, there was something called the Reactor Safeguards Committee, headed by a famous American, Edward Teller. And one of his ideas in the very beginning, when the government was first building the kinds of reactors Phil talked about, was to design for the worst possible accident. That terminology became the maximum credible accident in subsequent publications, and I'll return to that idea at the end of the talk. In 1955, the AEC established its first division of licensing under Harold Price, a lawyer. The early regulations that the AEC issued were mostly repetitions of things in the Atomic Energy Act amendment, and they were mostly procedurally oriented. They weren't very technical. There was controversy, as Phil has covered, in the early years, emanating from the Joint Committee, where the Republicans favored industry lead in the development of nuclear power, and the Democrats preferred government lead. A hybrid arrangement emerged, along with numerous demonstration plants, varying technology, and shipping port being sort of the culmination of that development period. Next slide, please. So some of the early developments, Phil mentioned Dresden 1 and Indian Point 1, the first fully commercial plants. They got their construction permits in May of 1956. About this time, Brookhaven National Laboratory undertook to produce an estimate of the consequences of one of those maximum credible accidents in a document called WASH 740, a document that lived in infamy for many years up until the time of the reactor safety study. WASH 740, this first edition, predicted 3,400 people would die from a maximum credible accident of a nuclear power plant. I don't believe it was a 1,000 megawatt plant. They looked at it later, and we'll talk about it later. At about the same time, the government decided to provide indemnity for major accidents under the Price-Henderson Act amendments to the Atomic Energy Act. There were other amendments about that same time requiring the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards. This is sort of the successor to Teller's Reactor Safeguards Committee. The ACRS was required by Congress to review all license applications, and Congress required there to be public hearings on both the construction permit and operating license. So clearly a two-phase licensing process envisioned by the Congress, and opportunities for public involvement. Things started to change about the same time on radiation standards. They were revised downward by the National Committee on Radiation Protection and Measurements. In April of 1959, the AEC issued more rules, this time on radiation protection and reactor siting. And by 1959, Dresden 1 went into operation. Look at the time difference there, 56 to 59. We haven't built a reactor in 3 years since then. In November of 1959, AEC elevated the stature of the regulatory organization within the AEC organization. It went up to the assistant general manager level, which is basically the same as the weapons development function or the research function and so forth. Things started to go a little bit south in January 1961 with the first significant accident. The SL-1 Army reactor at the National Reactor Testing Station had a power excursion, a rod ejection accident, killed 3 operators on a night shift. Next slide. So Phil set the stage for this slide. The Joint Committee had as a goal reaching commercial viability in 10 years. Lord knows where they got 10 years, but they knew if nuclear power was going to work for the various purposes that Phil outlined, it had to get commercially viable in a relatively short period of time. So
Holly, it looks like maybe we've lost Roger for a minute. Is he, you're working to help us reestablish that?
I can still hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. We may have just lost your video.
Yeah, Roger, why don't you go ahead?
You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So the fuel, the cores got bigger, the fuel got more complicated, things took a while to develop. Experience had to be developed. Higher operating temperatures in shipping port. They raised the operating temperatures to get more out of the cores, more thermal energy out of the cores. The higher operating temperatures led to cracking problems and downstream effects on Nuclear Regulatory Commission oversight. The changes that were made between the initial plants and the scaled up commercial plants headed for commercial viability were not well engineered. Phil mentioned the use of boric acid as another example of things of a change that would have an effect years downstream, decades downstream from decisions made early in the program. Next slide, please. We talk about quality assurance a lot in the nuclear enterprise. Quality concerns began to emerge from the commercial fleet very early. They grew worse as plants grew larger, and nothing was really done about it for some years. So here I am in 1960, 1961. It's not until troubles with the Advanced Test Reactor in Idaho and the Oyster Creek boiling water reactor in New Jersey in 1967 that things started to change. I'll come to that later. Again, the early push for nuclear supremacy focus of the safety reviews was power control, especially avoidance of power excursions, and on containment design. The early thought was you could contain a core melt with the containment. You didn't need to have backup cooling systems, etc. Clearly, that went by the boards within a few years as the power levels increase. In June of '61, there's an important Supreme Court decision about this language in the Atomic Energy Act about providing adequate protection. And the Supreme Court ruled in '61 that AEC had to provide reasonable assurance of adequate protection. There was another Supreme Court decision in '87 that the level of adequate protection need not and almost certainly will not be the level of zero risk. So these are kind of the origins of that terminology, reasonable assurance of no undue risk. Important milestones in the guidance for the regulatory function in America. Next slide, please. Another early development is in the siting area. The Indian Point 1 reactor was close to New York, but in 1961 when it was licensed, but by 1962, Con Edison decided they'd put a plant in downtown Brooklyn. The site is shown here with the coal-fired plant that I guess was eventually built there. You can see it's in a metropolitan area. There were several years of debate over that site. The ACRS took sort of the lead role. Both the ACRS and the regulatory staff were negative on the location. Con Ed eventually withdrew the application, and that's how Indian Point became the de facto limit on metropolitan siting in the United States, condition that exists today. The NRC has things underway to maybe change that a bit, but that's how it stands. Next slide. An important development in 1966 was the Ergen report. A man named Ergen produced this report studying emergency core cooling systems for light water reactors and the ability of large containments to cope with core melt. The report was put in motion by the ACRS, and it concluded you couldn't contain core melts with containment alone. You had to prevent core melts. A big shift in the philosophy of reactor safety occurred at that time. So by this time, the industry and the AEC have settled on Lightwater reactor technology, but for a couple other smaller plants, 2 HTGRs, Peach Bottom and Fort St. Vrain, and the still hopeful Clinch River breeder reactor in Tennessee. Next slide. This is an important slide, and Phil's already touched on it, and I'm going to try to dig a little deeper. In the early days, and here we are in the late 1960s, I'm in the staff at this point, so I know of what I speak. The AEC envisioned industry leading the way to reliable and safe nuclear power. And then government, the regulatory people, would come along behind to codify good practices. Now that leaves out the research function. The government was still doing some research for reactor development, but the basic philosophy is the regulatory people would not be in the lead in setting good practices for safety. We would let industry take the lead. The problem was industry fell short. Unsatisfactory engineering performance by vendors and architect engineers were countered by growing AEC question lists and licensing reviews. I'll stop here from the slide and give you a couple examples. In 1965, the Oyster Creek plant in New Jersey got underway. It got completed in 1971, and in the licensing of Oyster Creek, the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board, the required hearing board, said to the regulatory staff and to the commission, you haven't set detailed enough criteria for us to know whether this design is adequate or not. What are your general design requirements? And the hearing was held up, an effort was
Roger, you froze again. You may want to turn off your video, and it may help with the bandwidth.
Am I back?
Yes, we
Jim,
can hear you. But don't turn your video back on, and it may help.
Okay, I'm going to try to proceed without the video and we'll see if that works.
Thank you.
So in the building of Oyster Creek, another problem arose, and that was quality assurance. And the resolution of the quality assurance problems in Oyster Creek was the production in 1970 of Appendix B to 10 CFR Part 50, the quality assurance requirements for nuclear power plants. At this point, the government, the AEC regulatory staff, is starting to take the lead, starting to step up. As Phil said, rather than telling industry to stop and get it right, the regulatory staff started to take control. It was conflicted, frankly. We were studiously avoiding being on the critical path for licensing nuclear power plants. Licensing was a long, tortured affair. It grew longer and more tortured as time went on, but staying off the critical path was an essential performance by the AEC regulatory staff, and it affected how we began to tell people what was acceptable to us rather than following along behind and codifying good practice. About the same time, the environmental movement took off in America and had an effect on nuclear power. The Union of Concerned Scientists in 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act in 1970, the Natural Resources Defense Council in 1970. In May 69, Minnesota proposed effluent radiation standards more stringent than the AEC had proposed. Differing professional opinions erupted inside the AEC. Eventually, the regulatory staff won out, and you'll see on the next slide, began to develop the Appendix I to Part 20. So I'm sorry, Appendix I to Part 50. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide. There was also intervention in the environmental area. Anthony Roisman intervened in the Calvert Cliffs licensing, and the net result was a decision by the courts that the Atomic Energy Commission had to produce an environmental impact statement for every licensing action, CPEOL. So that became another box to check in the licensing process. 1972, the Beer Committee, it's met a number of times since then, but in 72, it reconfirmed support for the linear no threshold dose effects hypothesis. 72 to 74, there had been a number of interventions by the Union of Concerned Scientists in licensing actions on the grounds that the ECCS rule being applied by the staff were inadequate. The commission stepped in, caused a national rulemaking hearing on emergency core cooling. Differing professional opinions broke out within the regulatory staff and between the staff and the laboratories. The net result of that work was the production of 50.46, 10 CFR 50.46 in Appendix K on emergency core cooling, 2-year process. Simultaneously, the hearing was undertaken by the commission to establish limits on effluents from Lightwater reactor nuclear power plants. They were eventually published in Appendix I to Part 50, and as low as reasonably achievable was specified. A highly controversial thing to do in the radiation protection community, but that's what happened. 74 is the beginning of the oil embargo from the Middle East. President Nixon caused a study called Project Independence to be undertaken. 1,000 nuclear power plants were to be produced by the year 2000. The study was headed by William O'Dowd, who was a commissioner. He was the regulatory lead commissioner of the Atomic Energy Commission at the time. And the push for the regulatory people with the publication of that report was to streamline licensing requirements and procedures, stay off the critical path. By this time, 1974, the voices of the environmental activists, the people concerned with nuclear safety, had grown large over the question of the conflict of interest within the Atomic Energy Commission, the need to promote and regulate at the same time. And Congress developed the Energy Reorganization Act in 1974, and NRC came into being in 1975. We could go to slide 14. NRC the regulatory staff really had been developing a measure of independence beginning in the late 60s and extending through the 70s, leading up to the Energy Reorganization Act. After it was a standalone agency, those efforts were solidified. A whole body of licensing requirements and regulatory guides, standard review plans, branch technical positions were issued. Industry, I've used the word capitulated here. I think it's strong, but it's right. Just tell us what you want. Don't ask us questions over and over. Don't tell us to bring another rock. Just tell us what you want. Now, NRC didn't have a corner on talent, but the pressure to get licensing done and off the critical path was strong. And so the staff also had greater success in resolving issues in contested hearings. We were just better at it than the owner operators were. So the staff continued to take the lead in saying what's required. This deferral to NRC, a reversal of the original intentions, persisted until 3 Mile Island occurred, and if anything, it accelerated at that time. Now, it reduced uncertainty for license applicants and sped things up, but it let license reviewers decide engineering issues rather than reviewing and approving industry solutions for engineering issues. It was backward from what was intended. Next slide. There were a number of initiatives undertaken to reduce licensing and financial uncertainty, including standard designs and the so-called National Standards Program. Some 60 standards organizations were recruited by the NRC Office of Standards Development to get involved in a planned, organized system of standards. I've mentioned 4 of the most important standards organizations here, and standards were produced nationwide in fairly rapid order. If you looked at a license application, say in the 70s, an OL, say in the 70s, 80s, you're going to see like 500 national standards referenced in those license applications. Now, there was a reverse effect of this. This helped to limit the power of individual license reviewers. If NRC endorsed a standard and said that's required to meet the regulation, then license reviewers couldn't make things up as they went along, which was always a problem. You've got lots of plants being reviewed by lots of different people. They have different points of view on how the regulations are to be met. But setting standards and setting branch technical positions and having standard review plans, we began to more carefully control the basis of the safety review. A mistake that we made in this period was when we would have meetings to resolve technical issues, the people who tended to sit in the front row for the owner operator were the designers rather than the owner operator. This was a mistake that persisted until it was revealed by the events at TMI in 1979. And NRC, I think, has done a good job of reversing that issue in the years since. A couple other things that happened in the early NRC: it got its own research program. It's got its own technical assistance program, tens of millions of dollars per year in the 70s in these programs. It developed control of its regulatory requirements through what we knew affectionately at the time as the Ratchet Committee, Regulatory Requirements Review Committee. Those efforts eventually led to something called the Backfit Rule 50.109 that came out in 1988. Again, a way to elaborate on what is meant by reasonable assurance of adequate protection. Slide 16, please. Next slide. There we go. So a seminal event in the development of regulation, of course, the reactor safety study, the dawn of PRA. It initially met with some ACRS resistance. It was the staff liked it, had been involved in its production, but probabilities and uncertainties were novel concepts in those days, and there was skepticism. We began to apply it in some generic areas. We were studying anticipated transients without scram. It had a particular usefulness in that, and we began to use it in some sabotage studies, looking at the vulnerability of nuclear power plants to sabotage. Congress picked up on the ACRS resistance, mirrored it, and forced NRC to not rely on PRA in licensing. Along comes the TMI event in 1979, which resembled the high pressure core melt sequence in WASH 1400, and overnight PRA was in vogue. Risk-informed development of TMI requirements and oversight of operating reactors, use of it in a licensing hearing, the development of PRA standards, seismic PRAs, plant-specific PRAs, even risk monitors in control rooms to control risk in real time. It took off. But one still has the situation today where you can have operations enlightened by risk monitors in a control room, but you still have to conform to your license, because the tie between the deterministic approach in safety and the license is tight, and that's what the requirement is. The requirements are in the license. Some changes are occurring, as we know, in risk-informed regulation. Even today, though, the old deterministic methods of the past are still in favor in some quarters. Next slide. So then things began to accumulate in operating experience. Next slide. The Browns Ferry fire in 1975 led to branch technical position and a regulation on fire protection. Basically, the problem is plants had been built, big plants had been built with lots of closely spaced electrical systems, both power and instrumentation, and it had to be fixed, as illustrated by the Browns Ferry fire. The TMI event, an operator error converted a otherwise routine upset into a high pressure core melt sequence. The event revealed inadequacies in training, procedures, all of those things listed there. Next slide. An important thing learned from TMI was mindsets and complacency. Myopia, thinking that the bad things can't happen to you. We can't have a maximum credible accident. Complacency, we've done enough. Those things were revealed both for the industry and for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission by that event. Lots of improvements were made. A couple references there where you can see the changes. The most important one was the creation of the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations using peer pressure, self-insurance, training, inspections. They've done a terrific job over the years in leading the way to operational reliability improvements. Next slide. Some other events that continued to affect regulatory requirements and lead to greater safety over time were the Atlas precursors at Salem in 1983. This was kind of the last straw in operational reliability or unreliability, leading to the 1991 maintenance rule. The loss of feed water event at Davis-Besse, multiple common mode failures. I think somebody counted 14 at one point. This led to risk-oriented criteria for auxiliary feed water and an elevation of their safety significance for pressurized water reactors. The sleeping operators at Peach Bottom in 1987. It wasn't just the sleeping operators. When they shut the two plants down, I was on their oversight committee at the time, put there because of the sleeping operators. The inspections of the plant revealed thousands of non-conformances with the design basis. My favorite was the consoles in the control room and had not been properly anchored to the floor. In the event of an earthquake, some of them would have toppled over. That led to exploration of other design conformance issues in plants across the country. And design basis conformance became a watchword of the late 80s and into the 90s. In the 90s, we had a series of shutdown plants, year, 2 years, longer sometimes, because of operational performance problems, because of design basis conformance problems. At one time, I saw that 14 of 27 plants in NRC Region 3 were shut down for this troubled plant syndrome. So there are lots of operating experiences going on in this period, all of which led to the accumulation of requirements, accumulation of inspection modules, more and more intervention by the NRC in the operation of nuclear power plants. Next slide. And those go without mentioning of these disasters. Chernobyl, suppression of design flaws, failure to deal with design flaws, lacks operational discipline, a catastrophic event, spread radiation over much of Northern Europe. Huge social, political, economic consequences. An event at Davis-Besse without those kinds of consequences was the discovery of the hole in the reactor pressure vessel, the reactor head. It undermined the licensing presumption that reactor vessels don't fail, and it showed again the importance of discipline and engineering and management of operating reactors. And then the Fukushima event in 2011. I don't know if you're like me watching it on television, but I heard Edward Teller, worst possible accident. You remove all power, you remove the ultimate heat sink. Well, what's going to happen to those 3 plants? They're going to melt down. It just it was terrible. It's a catastrophic external event, a cliff edge. Those plants were driven off a cliff edge by events leading up to the tsunami. So I'll summarize what I think stand out as the important lessons from the history of regulation of nuclear power. Let's go to slide 23, please. One more. Phil said this a slightly different way. Regulation provides a framework with which minimum standards are established and safety is reviewed on each license application. The NRC has developed, the NRC is dependent on professional standards organizations to develop technical consensus for reliance by NRC and the nuclear industry in meeting licensing requirements. Those standards should not be forgotten as we move forward in time. It's a huge resource. Industry experience gained at TMI led to the formation of INPO, probably the most important thing done for safety in my lifetime, which promotes excellence in operation of licensed plants. The next 4 I'd call the 4 commandments of nuclear safety in America. Fulfilling regulatory requirements and obtaining a certification of or license does not make a reactor safe. Bill said that already. Adequate design for nuclear safety is the responsibility of the developer designer with oversight by the owner operator, not the NRC. Develop a safe plant, take it to NRC and prove it meets their requirements. Don't reverse the order. Ultimate responsibility for safe design and operation rests with the license holder, not the NRC. And liability for protection of the public and the environment belongs to the license holder. Next page. There's a dichotomy that I see today where new reactor developers seem to want NRC to define what constitutes reasonable assurance of adequate safety and performance terms, but without as much detail as in the past on how to get there. That's my perception. Maybe I'm wrong, but 55 years of regulatory experience, I think I'm probably pretty close to right. Now, this is the same approach that failed when AEC entrusted early LWR developers and licensees to define and achieve adequate safety. So maybe that's still the right approach. The future holds an opportunity to get it right the second time. We also learned that industry failed to fulfill its role in public hearings and operational performance. And those failures invited government intervention. If we're going to get back to depending on industry, then such failures have to be avoided. INPO goes a long way with the operational performance problem. Dealing with hearings, proving your reactor is safe, we'll see how it goes in the future. Because people didn't do as well in the past, faced with no alternative for getting and keeping plants licensed, AEC and NRC became more prescriptive, changed requirements in response to emerging events. Prescriptiveness had a good side. It reduced business risk for investors, but it shifted the burden of responsibility. Next slide. By the late 80s, everyone concluded NRC had overdone prescriptiveness. Even chairman of the NRC said so. And by 1995, NRC moved towards performance-based risk-informed regulation. Congress has taken up the cry, and we now have congressional legislation requiring that for new regulation at NRC. Over the same time, safety has improved. Design and operating features have improved to reflect changes in technology, social political factors, and operating experience. Social political factors, that is, I don't think we get as much intervention from the anti-nuclear crowd today as we used to, maybe because of global warming. There have been significant improvements in operational reliability, including plant availability. It's like building 20 new plants to raise the plant availability from 60% to 90%. Nuclear energy is important in obtaining domestic goals for decarbonization and power system diversity and reliability and resilience. I don't think there can be any question of that at this point. Innovative and advanced reactor technologies may offer greater assurance in demonstrating that adequate levels of safety are achieved. God bless you. I hope you do so. Finally, I think the most important thing we've learned from the experience, the post-TMI, post-Chernobyl, post-Fukushima events, is that social, political, economic consequences like those are not acceptable. With the exception of Chernobyl, nuclear power hasn't hurt a lot of people off-site. Yet it's caused significant social, political, and economical consequences, which aren't acceptable, and we just have to prevent them in the future. With that, Jim, I hand it back to you.
Thanks very much, Roger. Good summary. Just a few words on the next slide about my background, and then I'll work through some wrap up and some observations from the inputs that Phil and Roger provided. As I mentioned, when I get past my piece, we'll have 30 or 40 minutes we'd expect for questions that you've either already sent in or that you can send in between now and then. So again, I won't go through this in detail, but in general, I've been in the business for about 40 years. About 3/4 of that was in the commercial nuclear industry, primarily with boiling water reactors. Just before joining the Idaho National Lab team about 10 or 12 years ago, I was involved with design certification for the GE Hitachi ESBWR, so that's a generation 3+ Lightwater reactor. And then I've been working primarily on commission policy and licensing topics associated with advanced non-water reactors, again, for the last 10 or 12 years in association with the INL and in support of industry. Next slide. So I guess as Phil and Roger and I were going through this material and pulling it together, you know, it really becomes pretty apparent, and I think one of the messages we wanted to get across today is that the regulatory framework, and I'll mention in a couple of slides what we mean by that, but the regulatory framework of the structure that we have today really primarily came into being through these three major eras. There's what we referred to as the searching phase there at the bottom. That's as we were making the handoff between military applications and the commercial sector. At the same time, the AEC was working to find its way or to determine what a regulator ought to be and ought to do. We had the early days of the NRC there in the second half of the 70s. And then we had a series of learning experiences through operational events and other insights that have been occurring since then, but were coming into play in the late 70s to early 80s, but up to the present day. Next slide. So again, this is just another summary with a few bullets associated with each of those three eras. Again, the first item was the difficult position that the AEC was in, as it was both a promoter and a regulator. There was an increased amount of public interest and challenge in those days. There were some other challenges that were coming to the fore that both Phil and Roger mentioned as earlier and smaller designs or demonstrations were scaled up and used in different and larger applications, maybe some things that weren't anticipated along that path. Then again, in that second era, as NRC, as the independent regulator, is coming into the fold in the mid-70s, January 75 officially, they had a couple of major challenges. One was they were a new agency under some pressure to establish a more well-defined set of rules. And at the same time, you can imagine that there were a number of plants that were well along in their construction phase or had very recently started up. So as some of these new rules were coming together, or some of the operating events that occurred more recently, like TMI came along, they tended to be in the mode that both Phil and Roger, and especially Roger, mentioned, where they had a lot of capital investment and a lot riding on those nuclear plants running. And so their intention or their interest was, rather than getting into prolonged debates or dialogue with the regulator, it was more of this tell us what you want sort of a mentality. Again, that's not a completely comprehensive picture of every particular case, but for the most part, that was the way of doing business, is just tell us what we want. Tell us what you want. We need to comply and we need to move on so that we can operate the machine. So again, that continued into the early 80s. Probably one of the more significant events as far as changing regulatory requirements was, of course, 3 Mile Island, because it touched on so many different aspects of the reactor facility's operation and its underlying safety basis. It pointed out the importance of all of the effects on reactor safety that go well beyond just the design. And that includes the things like in that the second bullet there under item number 3, things like how the plant is operated, how operators in the control room make decisions. There were some material issues coming to light that now that plants had been running for 10 or 12 years, a number of training and other weaknesses in the process. So as Roger mentioned, industry has ramped up its efforts and made tremendous improvement in those areas, including efforts through INPO and other activities. NRC's increased and refocused some of its regulatory framework and oversight activities on day-to-day operations and day-to-day performance, so that everybody's working in conjunction to that common goal. But I guess, again, the overarching observation is that most everyone would agree, including, as Roger mentioned, the chairman of the commission, that by the time we reached the mid to late 80s, the group or the structure of regulatory requirements really had grown to be probably overly massive or overly large and overly prescriptive in a number of different areas. But that's the framework that we generally currently have now, and that we're working toward updating going forward as we move into the advanced technology sector and their deployment. Next slide. So now that we have this large number of regulatory framework topics, they sometimes are referred to folks as a patchwork of requirements and guidance. And that has come to be partly because as new and different things are learned, they're applied in the regulatory structure in different ways at different times, not always done consistently. So something that might have been a general design criteria in 1975 comes along in 1985, and rather than being added to the list, it's characterized or packaged in a different place, in a different part of the regulation, in a different part of the guidance, in a different part of the acceptance criteria that NRC applies. So that's just been a bit of the nature of the beast. It has to do with the period of time when the issue occurred or when it was incorporated into the regulatory framework. And again, the other thing to keep in mind is both industry and NRC are trying to move forward with a relatively workable common set of rules that they're applying to over 100 plants built over a couple of decades that are all in, although they're all light water reactors, are all somewhat significantly different from plant to plant. So it's a pretty big job, and the framework has become what it is for many of those reasons. We hear this term framework pretty often, and I guess I'd like to just clarify what it means or what its major parts are. It really has four parts or four major elements. You'll see those in the middle of the slide there. There's the underlying or overarching Energy Reorganization Act authorizing language that created the NRC. And again, that's connected to the Atomic Energy Commission and the commission policy. So there's that overarching piece. And then in conjunction with that, there are a series of regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations, as I'm sure many of you are aware, and in a series of documents that describe how NRC can accept ways for implementing those regulations. They're not the only ways, but they're ways that have worked in the past or ways that they consider to be acceptable. The third category are the specific licensing technical requirements that implement that commission policy and those regulations. And that's the area that is getting the most activity these days in the advanced non-LWR community, because it tends to be research and development and analysis focused as we establish what the technical capabilities and the technical requirements ought to be for new parts of new technologies. For instance, you can't apply light water reactor fuel temperature limits to other technologies like molten salt or a TRISO particle-based fuel design. And then the fourth major element of the framework are the process steps or the methods that are used to document that design and its in a license application format, along with the rules that the NRC applies for reviewing that application, along with the hearings and various regulatory bodies that need to touch the application on its path through the process. So those are the four major parts of the framework. As I think we've alluded to, the framework has generally served the industry very well. Unless you work in it every day, it's a bit difficult to understand if you try to pick it up and sort it out as a cold reader. But again, it's served the industry pretty well. It tends to be very light water reactor focused, as you'd expect, since it was developed and maintained primarily to support the operating fleet. But we've learned quite a lot, as Phil mentioned, in the many tens of thousands of reactor years of operation that we have worldwide, along with some of these process experiences that we had during the 60s, 70s, and 80s in pulling the current framework together. Next slide. So a couple of words about the safety case. All commercial reactor facilities have to establish and clearly understand their underlying basis for claiming that they have a safe design and that it can be operated as a safe facility. The safety case has a close connection or a direct connection to three fundamental safety functions. These apply essentially to any reactor of any size, of any type. And those are generally acknowledged internationally as control of reactivity or being able to maintain reactor power, the capability to adequately remove reactor heat, and the capability to contain releases or the release of radionuclides. So those are the foundational three functions that every design needs to define and establish. And as you work your way through the regulatory framework and that large patchwork of information that we just talked about, you'll find that all of that material in one way or another finds its way back to one or more of those three functions. Sometimes it's a bit of a convoluted path, sometimes it's not always straightforward, but the underlying basis for all of the regulatory framework has some connection to one of those things. Next slide. Oh, before we leave there, I almost forgot my picture there. So that picture, as we talk about defining the safety basis or the safety case, and there are a number of activities and projects underway these days to develop demonstration projects or to do research on specific activities that might help to build the content of the safety case. This picture is from the Idaho site. It's from 1955, and it's a reactor called the Heat Transfer Reactor Experiment. It was successful back in the mid-50s, and its purpose was to show that a reactor could be both adequately controlled and could generate and move heat fast enough to be able to power an aircraft engine. So this was part of the early days of the project when the military was looking for nuclear-powered aircraft. So one of the early demonstration reactors. Next slide. So I saw a couple of questions in the chat, and we'll come back around to these as a group at the end, but I did want to highlight a message that both Phil and Roger covered, and it's that if you take a step back, you really need to work toward clearly understanding the design you are developing and clearly reflect or consider how it will be operated, and develop a very robust design that's very resilient. If you do those things, and I know this is a way oversimplification, but if you do those things, the licensing process should be relatively straightforward. You design a plant that has a very robust safety signature and meets the needs of the owner-operator. You prove that safety case meets all of the associated regulatory requirements with potentially significant margin. The margin is the key. You communicate your proof in a license application. If your story makes sense and you can prove those margins, the NRC licensing process should, in theory, be relatively straightforward. And then the plan going forward is you need to operate and maintain the facility so it stays inside the bounds of what you assumed up front. So what do we mean by a resilient and robust design? I mean, that tends to be a design that uses passive and inherent systems wherever it's able to perform those three fundamental safety functions. You work to rely very little on active systems or require the action of an operator to move things forward. You want to consider misoperation or the plant being put in a configuration that may not have been intended by the original design, and make sure that it can survive that situation, still with margin and still without creating any issues or problems. And you also need to look closely at common mode types of failures, so that rather than creating multiple trains or divisions of the same kind of hardware or emergency hardware that can all be affected by the same failure, you create a diverse arrangement of layers and structures for addressing safety issues, and again, working through those three fundamental safety functions. So again, in theory, fulfilling the regulatory requirements should be a relatively easy job and just a matter of some adaptation and communication with the regulator if you do the job right on the safety case and in developing the design and the operating strategy. Again, accounting for some of those unforeseen issues that are at the bottom of the slide there. Next slide. So the license applicant is responsible, obviously, for establishing and communicating how it meets how its safety case meets those regulatory requirements. And that, that's done through the license application process, along with the supporting documents that go along with it. As Phil mentioned, and I think Roger emphasized, a problem or an issue that arose in the 60s and 70s was that this tended to be a dialogue primarily between designers and NRC, without the owner operator necessarily being in the loop or not having much engagement or involvement. That's not really the right way to move forward for two reasons. The owner operator is ultimately responsible for the design, so they should be front and center in that discussion. And then secondly, as we've seen, the owner operator and its organization can affect how the design works and can affect its safety margins, again, through the training of its staff, the way it may configure the plant, the way it's working to establish and address end user needs. So the owner operator is really a critical part of the whole process. So we always need to keep that history and that experience in mind, so that we don't get into a mode of only designers and regulators in some of our processes going forward. Again, I wanted to highlight that point in the middle bullet, where that in the NRC regulation that talks about what ought to be in a license application, it clearly describes the expectation that design, construction, and operation are all considered in the evaluation of the facility. As mentioned again a couple of times earlier, the NRC's role is to review and confirm that you did a good job in the safety assessment and didn't miss anything. It's not to tell you ahead of time what will pass or what you should do. That's really the role of the designer and their owner-operator partner. With that said, though, we have a sort of a balancing act here between the regulator and the developer. It's the developer's responsibility to put this story together, but on the other hand, the regulator can't be in I think Roger referred to it as the bring me a rock syndrome. That's an issue that's been a problem a bit in the past, particularly with the topic of defense in depth, because it hasn't been well defined in the past. So in some cases, particularly with new technologies that the regulators are less familiar with, if we're not careful, we could be in a mode of bring me a rock and keep making it larger, and I'll tell you when it's large enough. That's an approach we want to avoid. And I think both NRC and industry are working pretty closely together to use some of the experience from the past and also structure a path going forward. As Roger mentioned, that's being driven by Congress and many stakeholders these days. But work toward right-sizing an approach that steers away from bring me a rock, but assures that we do a comprehensive and a conservative job. Next step, or next slide. So again, I just wanted to re-emphasize this concept of the owner-operator is ultimately responsible for the machine and how it's operated and how it may affect the public. The owner-operator is also the person or the organization that holds the license, so they're the primary interface with the regulator. They're closely and strongly supported by the developer and the designer. Well, the designer obviously has the most insight into the detail of the design. So the point is they need to work hand in hand in achieving nuclear safety. Next slide. So a few points you've heard before or earlier today, insights from past experience. In many cases, developers haven't been as rigorous as maybe they could have been in establishing their safety case. In some cases, in the earlier days of the industry, the margins that were being provided either weren't well understood or weren't adequately characterized. There were some issues that came along during plant operation, and primarily materials issues that started to crop up, 10 or 12 or 15 years down the line with the operation that weren't fully understood or considered in the original design. A number of those kinds of issues. The other point that I think was borne out particularly with 3 Mile Island in the second bullet is we need to be sure that we don't focus only on the reactor and its support systems. There are a whole host of other things that are very, very important, including how external events can affect the facility, how the non-safety or balance of plant parts of the plant can create transients or effects on the reactor system, operator training and how humans interact with machines, how they understand control room indications or what's happening around them, and then the effects again of connected loads, particularly as we move into industries where we may be providing process heat or supporting hydrogen generation using some non-electrical, non-traditional sources of for the energy being produced by advanced reactors. In some cases, as I mentioned before, owners or owner-operators have either on purpose or by default taken a bit of a back seat to the developer and the designer and just relied pretty heavily on them to take care of everything that was needed in developing the design without maybe clearly pushing its own operational needs and safety responsibilities and its own conservative approaches into the design to make sure that everything was completely addressed. Not to say that designers aren't taking conservative approaches, but again, there's an operating aspect that current day designers, I think, do a much better job at addressing. And as Phil and Roger both mentioned, we do have about 17,000 reactor years of operating experience now worldwide, predominantly light water reactors, but there is quite a mix out there. And even though you may think if you're developing a non-LWR going forward, you can't learn very much from the light water fleet, I think that we actually can in a lot of these examples that we've covered. Next slide. So again, where we find ourselves is with a light water reactor-based regulatory framework. If you really peel back the onion and look at those 4 key pieces that are inside of it, you'll find that surprisingly, there aren't that many regulations that are LWR specific. The bulk of them can be used as they are or with relatively minor adaptation for non-water reactors. The areas of most interest and that are going to require the most work are ones that are associated with licensing technical requirements. For instance, as I mentioned in the second bullet there, as reactor power outputs continued to increase and as reactor events were better understood, it became clear that the containment wasn't going to be adequate by itself to maintain radionuclides and contain them in a way that would protect public health and safety. So again, that's the removal of heat and the containment of radionuclides are 2 of those 3 fundamental safety functions. So there are a series of regulations that are very specific to this emergency core cooling system arrangement and how light water reactors accomplish those functions. But if I remember right, Roger, I think you told me you were the original author of that group of requirements, right? When you were mid-20s?
Yeah.
I think you said that was one of your first jobs was to write the ECCS rule. So
Yeah.
So the point going forward is that underlying remove reactor heat requirement or fundamental safety function will still be critical for all of the advanced technologies going forward. But we need to work in a way that's most effective and efficient for everybody to establish what that updated regulatory framework will look like so that it can accommodate different or alternate ways of cooling for the various designs coming our way. As Roger mentioned, in the early days, the vision was that the industry would sort out what those kinds of structures would look like, and then the NRC would primarily review and confirm. That didn't work perfectly well the first time through. My sense is at this stage it's working much better based primarily on the experience that's been gained over the last 30 or 40 years. But we're really in this mode of moving to a more performance-based structure where we focus on the fundamental safety functions and then try to provide some flexibility based on what we learned through those watershed days in establishing a structure that, again, is maybe a bit more efficient and a little more easy to follow going forward. Next slide. So just a couple of words here, and then we'll turn it over and work through questions that we've received so far. We're planning, as I said at the outset, nominally 2 more webinars in this series. We're interested in your feedback on whether these are touching on the right topics, or whether 2 more is the right number, or if it needs to be a bit more than that. But what we plan to focus on currently in the next webinar is drilling down a bit more into the specifics of the existing regulatory framework. So that'll review the differences in the various NRC document types, which are the policy, which are the rules, which are the guidance for implementing the rules, which are categories of other things, just to kind of work through that hierarchy so it's a little easier to sort out what's what within the framework. I think we'll also spend a little bit of time on the NRC's organization and what the various jobs are of the major parts of the organization. And that's primarily the commission, the NRC technical staff, and then the advisory committee on reactor safeguards, primarily those 3. We'll talk about how license applicants and NRC each use those same documents, but maybe in different but sometimes similar ways in addressing public safety. And we can also talk a bit about what the change mechanisms are for adapting those Lightwater-based framework documents as we move to a more performance-based and advanced technology structure. So that's the gist of webinar 2. It's like, again, understanding what's in the framework now and how to change it. Webinar 3 is going to focus on the various licensing processes that are available after you've established your safety case and you've applied this regulatory framework structure to the safety case. So it'll look at both the Part 50 construction permit operating license 2-step approach to licensing and the Part 52 combined license or design certification 1-step process. We're not going to necessarily try to suggest which is better, which is faster, which is cheaper, but we'll point out the steps along the way and where the relative financial and regulatory risks exist along that path. Another suggestion I got just earlier today before the webinar from a couple of industry stakeholders that we'll likely also cover in webinar 3 is, as you work through this license application, licensing strategy development document, development process, what are the various ways in which you can identify and protect business sensitive technical information within the regulatory process as you move through those efforts. So, again, I know there are a lot of developers in the community these days with a lot of different approaches to various things that all have some business sensitive content. So we can talk a bit about how to best protect that information while also maintaining the transparency that's required by the NRC's regulatory processes. And then we'll also spend some time talking about how NRC's pre-application process can be used to minimize risk and potentially speed up the effort once you actually submit the license application. Next slide. So again, either today or in your follow-up questions, or suggestions, we'd appreciate your input, both on feedback from today and then anything you'd like to see on the agenda or that we ought to specifically cover in webinars 2 and 3. There's an email address there where you can send that information, and we'll be sure to consider it as we put those future sessions together. I think I have one last slide. The other thing that I did want to mention too, in parallel to this webinar series, is that the NRC and the DOE have a memo of understanding in place that's associated with the GAIN initiative. It's essentially an agreement that we'll work together to communicate to industry on areas where the industry may be unclear or may have questions about how the regulatory process works. The way it's generally structured is that questions around understanding or navigating the regulatory process that you see there in blue in the middle of the screen. If you need help with those and would like to come to the GAIN initiative folks to work through some of those questions, we can generally help with the responses, and in cases where we need additional information or may need some additional insight from NRC, we have the MOU in place to gain that additional insight and can work to respond to those kinds of questions. So I'm just pointing this out as another available avenue for you to ask questions and get some guidance beyond this webinar and beyond any direct communication with NRC. And if you'd like to use that process, you can go to the GAIN website there at the bottom of the page, the regulatory portion. It has a place for asking those kinds of questions. I think that's all I have for today.
Jim, you want me to handle a couple questions?
Yeah, I think the way we were planning to handle this, depending on the number of questions we have, and I've got to catch up on what we've got, but I think what the plan was for Phil, for you to take a couple as you've been looking through them, and then we'll loop around through the group. But yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay, and I'll note is that feedback coming through to everybody, or is that just me? Not a problem. Okay. As Jim mentioned earlier, we'll take each of the questions that have been provided and provide you a written response to the group. That'll be done subsequent to the webinar today. I've gone through the questions that were directed to me, and I've picked a couple that I think would be worth talking about just a little bit more, and they build on some of the items and themes that Roger and Jim and myself have touched on as we've gone through this. One question that I think underlines a number of concerns is, and I'll just read the question as it's presented to me and then talk about it. Can you provide a definition of safe regarding a reactor design? I am one of those that would be fine considering regulatory compliance sufficient. Please clarify. So the question is, it goes back to the statement that having the regulatory requirements in place, having review by the NRC, doesn't make your reactor safe. Now, Holly, could you go back to Jim's slide number 9, if you would? Went a little too far. There we go. Thank you. I'm going to need number 10 also afterwards. Just using this as some wallpaper for purposes of our discussion, I wanted to re-emphasize something here that Jim's already made the point on, and that is the owner's responsible for the safety of the reactor. At the end of the day, the owner's responsible, the license holder. The designer needs to provide the owner with a safe reactor design, but then it's up to the owner. He's responsible both to the regulator and from a liability standpoint for the safety of the reactor. Now, what's safe? Well, there's a set of figures of merit, if you will, within the regulatory process that define what's protection of the public, what's protection of the environment. Those have to be fulfilled, all right? The question is to what extent does the regulatory set of requirements and the regulatory review ensure that that's going to occur, and that your compliance, which I think was the question offered, that your compliance results in a safe design? And the answer is the regulatory structure and its requirements and the reviews are only part of the equation. And I'll give you a couple of specific examples so you can follow through that thought process. In particular, the example I'm going to give you would not be adequately addressed by compliance with regulation, except at the very highest level, which is the owner is responsible for the safety of the reactor and protection of the public and the environment. Okay, at that level, you could say, well, everything's covered by compliance, but I don't think that's the question that's being asked. It's all the detailed regulatory items that you are in compliance with don't get you there. If I go back in history, the choices that were made in the 1960s on operating temperatures, material choices of construction of the reactor coolant system as an example, okay, and the chemical shim, reactivity control, the use of boric acid. Those three things together, and I'll give you a specific example, those three things together can result in a compromise of the safety of the reactor that would have never been touched on by compliance with regulation or by the level of knowledge that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or its predecessor, the AEC, would have ever fallen upon. The high temperatures chosen in the commercial world with the materials chosen for the reactor coolant system and in a pressurized water reactor were not well thought through, and there wasn't much basis. So the regulator would never been able to deal with that. There was not a basis, and I combine the problems of high temperature, choice of materials of construction, primarily nickel-based alloys, led us over the years to cracking of the reactor coolant system, and in particular, and that cracking of the reactor coolant system, and in particular, I'll take it to the penetrations on the reactor vessel head in a reactor. The cracking of those penetrations, the welds in those penetrations, led to leakage of boric acid out of the reactor coolant system. The leakage of the boric acid of the reactor coolant system ended up on the carbon steel base metal of the reactor vessel head. So let me just make sure how I cascaded that. Temperature I chose to originally use, which challenged the materials that I chose for the reactor coolant system. I combined that with boric acid reactivity control of the primary coolant system, and now I have cracking of the nozzles in the reactor vessel head, leakage of boric acid, and boric acid now on the reactor vessel head, and I end up with extreme corrosion to the point, and this is Davis-Besse as one example, but I can give you other plants that have had a very similar experience. So much corrosion in the Davis-Besse upper head that we were on the edge, we were beyond, I'll say it this way, we were beyond an analyzed accident. We had compromised the integrity of the reactor vessel. Now, that particular sequence of things and combination and cascading of events would have never been picked up nor taken care of as a result of regulatory review or regulatory requirements. Would not occur. In a similar fashion, if you go to the next slide, Holly. Jim's second bullet here, all right, talks about other effects that you have to deal with. Balance of plant's effects, human-machine interfaces. Let me just focus on those two. That takes you to the TMI-2 accident. We had a relatively simple upset in the balance of plant, way in the back of the balance of plant upset. The upset ended up with the plant trying to shut itself down, which it did, okay? And in the process of shutting itself down, there was this little pilot operated valve which opened up and didn't close. Now, this is all very simple. This is all normal operation of a plant in the sense of equipment fails, okay? And we're supposed to be able to respond to it. What occurred at that point is there was a terrible human machine interface problem. The operators didn't understand what was going on, and they took a relatively simple combination of equipment partial failure and turned it in to the accident which melded the core. So the balance of plant effects, the human machine interfaces, all that thing would have never again been regulated, and compliance would have never sent you to the right answer. This is looking at the design and how it's going to be operated and where there are vulnerabilities, and stress test the design for the potential for vulnerabilities. Again, compliance would have never taken care of this. Now, this gets into a discussion, which I'll take a second question, asked me by the same individual, but I think it's a very good question, is how do we deal with the operating experience, which it states as a question is nearly impossible hurdle to work because there's so much information out there in the 17,000 reactor years, which is the fourth bullet on Jim's slide here. That's not quite the hurdle that you suggest. I think it suggests the need to go understand what is available in the industry. At the very high level, there are reports that go through lessons learned out of the operating plants. And those are at a very high and a very summary level. And there's an example of one out of INL, which we'll put in writing to you with a number on it. There's broad ones that have been done by IAEA and NEA internationally. There's a database maintained by the OECD NEA group, which is called the International Reporting System. You notice that's IRS, okay? The International Reporting System that provides you a detailed searchable database of everything that's gone on so that you can query it in various systems, in various material applications, in various types of equipment. And there are multiple, there's another database maintained by INPO of industry, again, a searchable database of industry experience. And then there are multiple topical reports on operating experience that are put together by EPRI. Areas like common cause failures, digital INC experience, maintenance experience. And what I'm going through here is just a list that came to my mind. I expect there's more than what I've just said. But what there are clearly compilations of experience in the industry, sorted in a manner that you can search them and find experience that would be applicable to the design that you're working on, or as you evaluate its operating or potential operating experience going forward as part of working with potential future owners. So those two questions really get tied together. The first is what's safe, and I gave you an example of where the regulator would never help you from a compliance standpoint in avoiding material problems. I gave you a second one with regards to the TMI2 accident, and you can go back to the operating experience through the databases and types of reports that I outlined and summarized here. We'll provide that in writing with the detail for you so that you can go back and get at it. I only have one other item if you wish, Jim, and I'll just deal with it right now if you want, and then I'll turn it to Roger if that's okay. Want to do it that way?
You know, Phil, what I think I'd rather do is I saw another question, and Roger, I'll tee this up for you. It's on the same theme, so maybe while we're on this topic, I'll suggest we maybe go on to that one as well.
Okay.
The gist of the question is, if I don't have it in front of me, but the gist of the question is, if the existing regulations and regulatory structure don't assure the reactor safe, why don't we change or fix the regulations so that they do? Does that mean the regulation?
Yeah, I think. Go ahead.
In in my mind, I think there are two parts of that, and I'll shut up, Roger, so you and Phil can elaborate. I think the two parts that we need to think about there are the regulation provides a minimum acceptable level, so we always have to be able to design in some margin to that level to deal with uncertainties or occurrences in the future that may not have been considered. The other thing is that when the regulator evaluates a design, it's as a snapshot in time. Both the regulator and the owner-operator have oversight programs, but just because a reactor is licensed on day one doesn't mean that it'll continue to be in the same safe configuration for the next 80 years. I mean, there's an effort involved. So I'll shut up and let you clarify or expand on either of those thoughts or make your own.
Well, I agree with both of those thoughts. And it isn't just time that changes things, it's also detail. The owner operator is responsible for every nut and bolt. The NRC is not. Let me give you some examples of where the owner operator was licensed to do certain things and then didn't implement them. So one that sticks in my mind is because I spent a very long weekend responding to a petition by Ralph Nader to shut down all the nuclear power plants in America because the electrical connectors and safety related systems hadn't been qualified. Oh, well, the regulator assured that they had the appropriate qualification standards. It was the architect engineer and the NSSS supplier that failed to take responsibility for the electrical connectors between their two scopes of supply. That's not NRC's responsibility. That's the owner operator's responsibility depending upon his suppliers. I'll give you another example.
And Roger, before you go on, compliance will not identify nor protect you from what you just stated.
No, I'm trying to stick to the design ones because I think most of the people on a webinar today are
I'm trying to address the question asker who was saying compliance would be satisfactory, but go ahead.
I won't mention the plant, but it was in a foreign country and I was asked to go down and take it and kick the tires by the head of the regulatory agency. It was built by American companies. I chose to do an inspection of the aux feed water system. Through a translator, I talked to the people responsible for the maintenance of the aux feed water system. It was a system that had a steam-driven pump, as many systems do, steam and electric. I looked at the steam-driven, at the turbine, and it was right against the wall. And I asked the maintenance supervisor, how do you maintain that turbine? Oh, we've never maintained that turbine. Plant had been in operation for a number of years. I took it up with the plant manager. I'm sure it got fixed. That was an American designer that put that aux feed water turbine right next to the wall where the maintenance guys couldn't even open it. That's not NRC's responsibility to find that kind of error. That's the owner operator's responsibility, depending upon a designer. One more example. Internal flooding. Internal flooding got to be a big issue at NRC a few years back. I don't remember what generated it, but somebody asked the question, you got a non-safety related service water system, and what if it breaks? Huge pipes, lots of water. Are all of the safety systems that are in the aux building down low, are they protected sufficiently against flooding? Nope, some weren't. So it wasn't a safety related system. It was outside the scope of review by NRC for such a problem. But it was a safety problem because it would have been a common mode failure of safety systems in an earthquake. I'll stop there, but I wrote down some examples. There is a difference between the scope of review done by the regulator against certain performance criteria and the scope of responsibility of the owner operator and the designer. Other than that, Jim, I think you got it right.
Yeah. Phil, anything you want to add on that topic?
I could add more examples, but Roger, your example started at a Coney. and the issue, expanded to the industry as a whole. If I go back and try to emphasize one point that you made, and this is where you make the handoff from the designer to the operator, the owner, who is responsible for safety. You have to try to look at what are the vulnerabilities that the operator can experience, which are going to compromise the safety of the reactor that you designed for him. Now, I could go through multiple examples. I won't take the time while here on this webinar, but there are multiple examples where the actions of the operating company compromise the safety of the reactor because of a lack of understanding of the design basis of the reactor. And hence you look for those vulnerabilities in the design process and in the interaction with the owner operator during the design life to try to find where those vulnerabilities may be and plug them, avoid them. You won't find them all, but that's the type of thing that you can draw from operating experience that helps you the thought process start, even though it's Lightwater reactor experience primarily. It's where the thought process starts of where the vulnerabilities could be in your design, where the operator could cause a problem or not recognize a problem. This was something we constantly dealt with back in the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program. I called it, you may recall, sailor proof. That's not intended to be derogatory. That's how do you anticipate human machine interface problems and try to design against them so that the operator's actions can't inadvertently send you down a path you don't want to be on. Jim, there's one other thing or two other things I'd comment on. One is we talked about a definition of safety here. There's another aspect of this besides safe. There's also an aspect of challenged. We as an industry have an obligation, not as individual plant operators and that type of thing, and designers, not to allow the plant to get to a condition where the credibility of the business we're doing is challenged by the public. It may not result in an accident, may not result in any effect on the public, but it reduces the credibility of the reactor and challenges the potential sustainability of the nuclear industry. We have multiple evidences of those where the public loses confidence in the operator of the reactor, the owner of the reactor, and go as far as losing confidence in the regulator. Hence, you go look for things in the design of the reactor and the way it can be operated that may compromise how well it's operated, such that it becomes publicly aware of problems that will then challenge the credibility of the industry and how we operate. I had one other item, Jim, very briefly. There were several questions to me on spent nuclear fuel. Okay. All the way from how much does it cost and how do we dispose of it, et cetera. To do it full credit, I suggest we just do that entirely through the written word. I want to give it full credit on that discussion. I'll comment only on one part of it, and that has to do with to what extent have we, as an industry, been looking at recycling and reprocessing. The answer is the industry was originally set up that reprocessing and recycling was integral to the fuel cycle. That's back in the 70s. That changed because of national proclamations that said we weren't going to do that any longer, and I won't go through the history of that. And while that prohibition has now been removed, and it was removed in the Reagan administration, we had, as we go forward and have looked at the potential for reprocessing, so far, the reading I'm going to give you here is a decade old, so I'd be interested if it's changed. A decade ago, we went through and canvassed the industry through the GNEP program, and looking at the interest in closing the fuel cycle, reprocessing, recycling, and found from an economic standpoint, which is what drives obviously the private sector here, from an economic standpoint, it didn't make sense. It was more costly than an open fuel cycle and disposition via geological disposition as an example. Now, that could change, and we have at a low level continued to fund development activities on reprocessing and recycling. A lot of work's been done, as you're probably aware, in Europe and Japan in this area. The question is it of interest to the owner-operator community that we look again in a serious way at closing the fuel cycle? That question is where you start. It's not whether there's technology to do it. We can do it. In fact, reprocessing was an integral part of the Naval Nuclear Propulsion program fuel cycle for many, many years. And it was stopped in the mid-90s for not economic purposes, but for policy purposes in the Department of Energy. I suggest that if there's truly an interest in looking at closing the fuel cycle and other questions on spent nuclear fuels, that it's time to again ask the owner-operator community, those folks that will own and operate future nuclear reactors, whether they're interested in closing the fuel cycle, and it'll come back to an economic question, not a technology question. It'll come back to an economic question that has to be answered again. We answered it 10 years ago. Perhaps it's time to answer the question again. Jim, I'm done. I don't think I'll draw any other questions out here.
Okay. Roger, I see one or two others in here. Do you have? I see a couple I'd like for us to tackle, but I'll let you go first. If you've already picked something.
I get to pick my favorite, right? So I have a question about whether a plant can be designed and operated to have a maximum credible accident with no release of radioactivity. Yes, I think you can. And a group of us looked at that really carefully after Fukushima. The ASME president, hearkening back to earlier things ASME had done in its history, ordained a group of nuclear specialists, and we looked at the question of what should be done about the socio-political economic impact of accidents like Fukushima. The net conclusion was there needed to be a new regulatory construct, and that construct was not acceptable dose for big accidents, but no dose, no social, political, economic consequences. We've done a really good job in nuclear, in the West at least, in protecting people. We haven't done a very good job in protecting the social, political, economic consequences of reactor accidents. And the consensus was in that report, I won't go into the details, that criterion, that overarching goal of nuclear power could be met, and it needed to be met. It could be met even if you went searching for the so-called low probability cliff edge phenomena, like the big tsunami and the big earthquake. So if the asker or anybody else is interested, Google ASME Fukushima, and you will find that report. It's available on the web. It's a good read. It's got a lot of good historical stuff in there about regulation and the development of nuclear safety to today's level. One other, somebody asked about emergency preparedness and the idea that we could do less emergency preparedness with better designs, better reactors in the future, safer reactors, if you will. And whether there were lessons unlearned from TMI that had a bearing on that issue. That struck a chord. Yeah, there are lessons from TMI. The emergency preparedness lesson, the overriding emergency preparedness lesson from TMI was people didn't do what they said they would do. the emergency preparedness was on paper, it wasn't in fact, and it fell apart. There was a huge risk, upset in the NRC over that problem at TMI. It got fixed, and it cost a lot of money, but making sure people will do what they say they're going to do is a problem for the regulator. Another example is B5B after 9/11, where the nuclear industry, the operator owner, said they would provide certain capability to respond to an attack, and then didn't do it. Now that's been fixed through Flex. The industry's done a great job with Flex, but people have to do what they say they're going to do. And that lesson for the future and the role of the regulator, that's an important question. People have to do what they say. And let's see.
Roger, before you leave this emergency planning question, I did want to offer up some additional thoughts, and then you and Phil certainly can jump in if you agree or disagree. But the flavor I hear a lot these days on the topic of emergency planning is it's frequently portrayed as we're trying to reduce the level of emergency planning we're providing for the public, or we're trying to do something that's less than what's been done in the past. And I think the real story, or what we're actually doing is, and you touched on this in your presentation, when the TMI accident occurred, there were some similar events in the reactor safety study that weren't as thoroughly evaluated, through the various risk tools that were available at the time. And I think the message going forward is we're doing a couple of major things to better understand the emergencies that may occur, and then we're right-sizing the programs or the emergency planning zones so they align with that. So I think we're combining the many years of operating experience and engineering judgments that we've had in the past, and overlaying or integrating some risk assessment tools with that, so we have a more complete picture. And then in addition to that picture, we're also developing some plant designs that are more robust in the kinds of ways that I summarize, and I think Phil and you did as well, where they tend to be simpler, or they tend to have less reliance on active response. So when you put all those things together, you can make a pretty good case for doing something that's different than what's been done in the past, while still providing even more protection to the public. So we're not trying to get away with doing something less going forward. We're using what we've learned to make it the right size. Do you agree with that in general?
Yeah, I do. I just when we decide what we're going to do, let's do it. And that's my only point.
Yeah, I got you. Okay. Did you have another one, Roger?
Somebody raised the question of what does safe mean? That's a pretty philosophical question, and offered the idea that instead of saying plant X is safe and then having something happen and then we do something about it and then we say, well, it's safe again, we undermine our credibility. That we ought to be saying safe relative to what? Like coal-fired power plants or other things of greater risk than nuclear power. I don't disagree with that at all. I have a similar pet peeve about what we say. I try to avoid the word accident, because these things aren't really accidents. They occur because people screw up. They screw up in design, they screw up in hubris, they screw up in myopia. They think they know everything and they don't. And then something happens and it's terrible. Those are not accidents, those are screw ups. And I'll challenge somebody to find one that was an accident. It's kind of like, we used to talk about car accidents, but we don't talk about car accidents anymore. People get into collisions because they're not driving right, they're texting or they're doing something wrong. There are very few accidents in automobiles.
Roger, I did that one question that you addressed. There was another part of it which I would suggest you should think more carefully about. That whoever asked the question, and it has to do with He used Arrow's theorem, which is normative ranking of safety alternatives should be evaluated on a cost basis. Let me just offer, the public doesn't care. Okay? If the issue is the protection of the public, the issue is how do you keep me safe? How do you avoid me being my life or my livelihood being threatened? Relative cost is of little interest to them because we have, as you suggest, we have done ranking of the relative risk of nuclear versus other forms of power generation or energy production. And the answer is nuclear always comes out as most likely the safest major energy producing approach. However, that isn't what the public is interested in. So I think we need to rethink it and not do it in that manner. Roger, do you have any additional thought on that?
No, no. Public acceptance is a really, it depends on what happens.
Yeah. You can only get there in the cost basis if you're dealing with potentially an owner who's evaluating alternatives. But nuclear is so easy to show as one of the best alternatives that it loses its credibility in the conversation the minute you put it on an economic basis. I'll just leave it there. That's an interesting question. That's an interesting opinion. I think it deserves a much longer discussion, which I would invite the individual who asked the question to contact one or all of us, and we'll take a look at it from a formal question answering process here and give you an answer. But I'll note that it's a much longer discussion that we'd be interested in engaging with you on, because we have faced that for the last 55 years, Roger, maybe longer for you, okay?
Yeah.
We faced that question, and how do you talk about safe? How do you evaluate it? Is there a metric that you can apply? And the answer is it's a very interesting conversation.
Well, the safety goal effort by the NRC that followed TMI was a significant effort to kind of try to come to grips with that, about how safe is safe enough. And we haven't challenged that safety goal since it was written, at least not in this country.
Yeah, and I have no problem personally with the figures of merit at the very high level that exist in the regulatory structure now with regards to the protection of the public environment. Because anything that we design should be well within those requirements. Okay, and those are the ones, Roger, that emerged after the TMI-2 accident.
Yeah, well, as I said, we've not killed a lot of people with nuclear power. We've saved a lot of lives, but that the public acceptance doesn't come. And I think it's because of the social, political, economic effects of these big events. I mean, governments fall, billions of dollars are spent, innocent people are kept from their homes for decades. Those are not acceptable consequences, and they weren't thought out when the maximum credible accident idea and the number of deaths and the prevention of those deaths became the governing philosophy of safety in America, for the world, actually.
Now, this kind of conversation is where I mentioned the Socratic method earlier. And all right, this is where the Socratic method can be applied with great benefit. Because it takes a lot of people asking questions and getting rid of, there's one thing we learned within the naval program very quickly, is the presuppositions that exist in people's minds that they're using as the basis for the conclusions they draw. And getting those presuppositions out on the table and being more, what people might loosely call, be more objective. That's a general catch-all, but the issue is what presuppositions against, what's your point of reference, what are you assuming implicitly in whatever you're doing. That's a very important part of dealing with the question that this individual's asked. Excellent question. Jim, I have no others I would bring to the table.
I have two items I wanted to mention. We already covered the first one. We mentioned that question that was associated from one of the participants with well, if complying with the regulations doesn't make the reactor safe, then why don't we fix the regulations? I think we talked through that. I guess what I'd encourage that participant or anyone else who's on the line to let us know is if we weren't clear in that response, or if you still have questions, I'd ask you to send those additional questions, because I think it's a key point that we want to make sure is well defined and well understood as we walk away from this webinar series. And Holly has helped us there with where you can send those additional questions. The other one I was going to mention is in the question series, there's a relatively detailed question around reasonable assurance and adequate protection and how they're related and what the requirements entail associated with those two terms. We'll certainly put together a response to the question. I understand the question, but I think it's a bit more complex than I think we'd like to maybe knock out in a verbal response today. But I did see that question. I think it's a good one, and we'll work to develop an answer.
Jim, it might be, as people look at that very point, it might be worthwhile they take a look at subpart F of the draft, part 53, work that's going on for advanced reactors, which is it's really how do I maintain a reactor safe once it's designed and put in operation. It's an interesting concept, which they might be willing to read through. I presume they can find this thing publicly, is that correct?
Yes, NRC has started a series of public meetings associated with that rulemaking. They'll probably go on throughout the year this year. That's one that's recently gone onto the table in its draft form, and NRC is collecting public feedback.
Okay, and so it'd be worth looking at just so you understand the conversation of what it means to operate a reactor once you designed it and sold it. Okay.
I didn't see anything else in the list that we either didn't cover or that I didn't mention or that we'll cover in the follow-on. Roger, I'll just go around the horn here. Do you have anything else? Any closing thoughts or comments you'd like to make? We got a couple minutes left.
Yeah, there was one point you made in your closing that I wished I had said more about, and that was the importance of the balance of plant. Oops, I'm getting an echo. I don't know of an accident of significance that occurred because of physics of nuclear power. It was mostly operator error or balance of plant initiator or non-safety feeding on safety.
Or an external event, right.
Or an external event, yeah. Getting the physics right is important, and it's at the start. But after that, these problems come in from everywhere. And it's everywhere you have to look when you're looking for safety for the future.
I think, Roger, the thing I would add to that is the Achilles heel that the industry has had from day one is understanding the capabilities of the materials of construction, the metals. Okay,
That's true.
That we apply, really understanding them. I can go all the way back to the S1W prototype and the issues with material choices and what occurred and what didn't occur and why. And I can take it all the way up to yesterday's reactor problem in the industry. And every one of them deals with our understanding and the level of understanding of materials, applications, and how they will perform in the environments we put them. That's been an Achilles heel. Okay.
I agree.
Anything else, Bill? Any other closing thoughts?
Not any other thoughts, no.
Okay. Again, I would just like to thank everyone who joined us today. I hope you found the discussion to be helpful. We look forward to your questions. And again, I do encourage you to provide any inputs or suggestions you might have for webinars 2 and 3 as we currently have them envisioned, or if you see a need for a webinar 4 on a completely different topic, we're happy to consider that as well. So again, we look forward to your input, and thanks very much for your time today. Holly and Eric, I think we're adjourned.